Hello, and welcome to People Who Mysteriously Vanished, Real or Fake. Throughout the world, there are many cases of people who have disappeared, but most of them are tied with other motives, both mundane and sinister. This video isn't about those cases. Originally, this video was simply going to go over stories of people who have vanished, but after some research, some of them may not be what they seem. This topic was given to me by one of my viewers, but due to my recent computer issue, I lost my notes telling me who it was. So if it was you, please let me know, and thank you in advance. Vanishing Prisoner. The story goes that around 1812 to 1813, a man named Diderici was a valet that was incarcerated for impersonating his master after he died of a stroke. The man was serving his time at a prison in Wisłomund, Poland, when he escaped his sentence in an extremely odd way. It is said that while walking with other inmates, who were chained together by their ankles, he steadily became more and more transparent until he vanished in thin air in front of everybody. Quite an interesting story, and you may be thinking this has to be fake. It isn't. Kind of. The story itself is quite real, all except for the vanishing act. It seems that Diderici had a habit of trying to escape, and was kept in leg chains due to this at most all times. When the prison was surrendered back to Prussia from France, the prisoners came with it, and on the roll call sheet, Diderici had been marked as missing. When asked about this, the commander stated that perhaps he had fallen into the Vistula River while walking along the wall with no guards watching him. This revelation leaves a bigger mystery. Was Diderici killed by the prison guards, or did he try to escape again and drown due to the heavy leg chains? Farmer's Last Walk. A farmer named Orion Williamson lived with his wife and son on a farm in Selma, Alabama, and had a strange occurrence in July of 1854. While sitting on his front porch, Orion decided to move his horses into the shade. He got up and walked into his waist-high field, to which he turned and waved to some passing neighbors, and as he turned, he vanished into thin air. Upon seeing this, Orion's families and neighbors rushed to the spot and could find no holes, and his body was nowhere to be found. In some reports, there are claims that the grass around where he disappeared died in a circular pattern. So, what happened here? I'll get to this explanation in a little bit. You will see why I don't explain it here. Unfinished Race. This is quite a famous story that has even found its way on television programs about the topic. A man named James Byrne Morson lived in Warwickshire, England, as a shoemaker, and was known to make pretty tall wagers while he was drinking. During one such event, he claimed that he could run from their location to Coventry and back, which would be a total of 40 miles. On September 3, 1873, James set out to prove his claim, being followed in a cart by Barham Wise as a witness and Hammerson Burns as a photographer. After a few miles, Mr. Warson stumbled and fell forward with a cry and vanished right in front of the two men following him. They claimed he was in the middle of the road and vanished before even touching the ground. Both men were arrested since they were thought to have done something to James, but were later freed. No one ever saw or heard from Mr. Warson again. A possible explanation for this is coming after the next story, I promise. The Well. Here is another story that is quite famous, and sometimes the names are changed due to who is telling it. The original version is, near Quincy, Illinois, a 16-year-old boy named Charles Ashmore lived with his family on their farm. On November 8, 1878, Charles left the house to get water from the well, but never returned home. His father Christian and his sister Martha went out looking for him, and since there was fresh snow on the ground, they were able to follow his tracks. Halfway to the well, the tracks stopped, and there was no sign of struggle or any other tracks on the ground. Charles had just vanished. A search for the boy came up empty-handed. 4 days later, Charles' mother was walking the same path when she claimed to have heard his voice calling out once she got to the spot where the tracks stopped. The voice sounded distant, but came from all directions, and she couldn't make out what the voice was saying. For months after the event, members of the family had the same experience, but as time grew on, the voice became more and more distant sounding until it finally ceased in the summer of 1879. Did the boy fall into a different reality? Fiction takes reality. All three of the previous stories have circulated as actual events, and even while researching this topic, I was hard-pressed to find a connection. These stories were all found in a book called Can Such Things Be? By a writer named Ambrose Bierce. Mr. Bierce was a journalist and short story writer who was active between 1872 and 1909. The dates may vary minorly, but this is generally correct. He never stated any of his stories were fiction, but did state that most of them were in fact based off of real events. Being a journalist, many state that the stories in his books were written in a way to compile all the events of mysterious disappearances that he had seen or heard about. Others question how much liberty he took in writing his stories, and that he himself claimed were inspired by real events. Keep in mind, this was the time when newspapers would include purely fictional articles that were fantastic in nature just to take up space. There is no proof that any of the previously mentioned stories were real, nor is there any that say they aren't. What is real is the fact that in 1913, Ambrose was traveling to Mexico with the rebel troops during the Mexican Revolution and vanished himself. Reports vary from him dying in a firing squad to committing suicide to even statements saying he never even went to Mexico, but all investigations came up empty-handed. Odd. The author who focused on vanishing people mysteriously vanishes himself. Missing soldier. In a previous video, I covered the area in southwest Vermont known as the Bennington Triangle, which is famous for people turning up missing and strange UFO sightings. This story takes place in the same area, and I believe I talked about it in my previous video, but I'll include it here as well. James E. Tetford was a veteran residing at the Bennington Soldiers' Home and was out visiting his family in St. Albans. On December 1st, 1949, on his trip back home, he caught a bus and sat in the very last seats. According to reports, Mr. Tetford was sitting in his seat at the last bus stop before finally going to his home. Somewhere between the two locations, he vanished from the bus and left all his luggage and an open bus schedule on his seat. No one, including the bus driver, saw him leave, and the bus hadn't stopped to let anyone off. So did this happen? Yes, in fact it did, and no one is sure exactly what happened. Some may claim he left and no one noticed him, but that story doesn't fit with everyone else's reports. Pitstop to nowhere. In 1975, Jackson Wright and his wife Martha were driving from New Jersey to New York when their car's windows became too foggy due to condensation, and Jackson decided to pull over. According to the story, he stopped inside the Lincoln Tunnel, being as how, oddly enough, there wasn't any other traffic. Jackson worked on clearing the windshield while Martha got out and worked on the back window. As he turned around, he found that his wife was nowhere to be found. Mr. Wright claimed he didn't hear a sound from her or any cry for help. She just disappeared. Apparently, he did go to the police, but they couldn't find her or any other evidence either. Was this a real story? This one will simply be put down in the possible category. Some point out how hard it would be to stop undetected in the Lincoln Tunnel, while others find no evidence of the two being married or even existing. Maybe it didn't happen, maybe it did and was covered up, no one really knows. The Cave. Now here's a story that I wanted to cover for quite some time. This story has taken a life of its own, with many people being curious if it is real or not, especially when it became a creepypasta not long after. The story is affectionately named Ted the Caver, and is quite an interesting read. It is a long series of journal entries that can still be found on Ted's Angel Fire webpage that starts on December 30th of 2000 and ends on March 23rd, 2001. In this story, Ted finds a cave, and inside finds a strange small hole that evidently goes further inside. While fixated on this hole, he starts to have supernatural experiences and hallucinations. Ted and two other men, named Brad and Joe, hear ghostly screams and see strange hieroglyphics in the cave. After all three men start having terrible nightmares, they decide to go back one last time to find closure, but are never heard from again, and the journal entries end abruptly after this trip is mentioned. For the sake of time, I didn't do this story justice, but I'll leave a link to the page so you can read it yourself. Did a monster or ghost get the three guys, or is it pure fantasy? To finally set this story straight, on November 25th of 2004, the author, whose name is really Ted, stepped forward and stated the whole thing was real, except for the strange stuff. The men did find a cave, and it did have strange noises inside, from the freeway above it. Ted thought it would make for an interesting story for him to find a cave that was haunted, and ultimately result in the disappearances of all involved. So, I guess he was right, since you hear more about this story than the true story, which as of making this, was revealed 12 years ago. Strange find. In our final story, we find another man with a story about a cave, but does this one end the same way as the prior entry? A 47-year-old long-distance hiker named Kenny Veach was very active on Facebook and YouTube with what he found on his hikes into the Nevada desert. On one such occasion, he claimed to have found a cave entrance that was shaped like a capital M around Nellis Air Force Base. In one of his comments, he claimed that as soon as he entered the cave, his whole body shook, and the farther he went inside, the more vibrations he could feel, so he turned back. Months after this, he returned to search for the cave, this time armed with a gun since he felt he might need it, but he couldn't locate the entrance. 1 month later, on November 10th, 2014, he tried again, and with the intent of making an overnight hike, but was never heard from again. Was this a real story? Sadly, it is all real, and much of it is well documented on his Facebook page and YouTube videos. Investigators found his cell phone by an empty mine shaft, but couldn't find his body even with a camera that was put into the mine. Kenny's girlfriend stated she felt he possibly committed suicide, since he was battling depression. Others think he fell into a hole, while others feel he may have found something he shouldn't have. With that, be safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.